So good evening to everyone who's here with us this evening. I'm Esther Giles of the Socialist Labour Network Steering Committee, and I'm chairing the meeting this evening. This meeting, Never Again, has been arranged by the Socialist Labour Network in partnership with Jewish Network for Palestine, and thanks to our friends there. Saturday the 27th of January, today, is Holocaust Memorial Day, and we're holding this meeting to remember and commemorate all the victims of the Nazi Holocaust, and also to say never again for everyone. Not only did 6 million Jews die during the Nazi Holocaust, but so did Roma and Sinti Gypsies, disabled people, 3 million Russian prisoners of war, up to 3 million Poles, as well as millions of Russian civilians. In total, it's estimated that 15 to 20 million people died in the Nazi Holocaust. We welcome our speakers this evening, all of whom bring their perspectives to the memory of those whose lives were taken. We will hear from our speakers, and then we will have time to take contributions and questions from the floor to the panel. So our speakers this evening will be Stephen Kapos, Dr. Ghada Karmi, Ronnie Kasrils, Suzanne Weiss, Professor Ilan Pappe, and Tony Greenstein. And our first speaker this evening is Stephen Kapos. Stephen, we welcome you again. And just to remind people, Stephen was born in 1937 in Budapest, Hungary, to a family of Jewish heritage. And from 1944, his family was in hiding from the Nazis. His father was deported to Belsen and Herrnstadt. His mother and siblings and Stephen were in hiding on false papers. He left Hungary for the UK following the 1956 uprisings in Hungary and spent his professional career in the UK as an architect. Stephen was a Labour Party member from 1997 until last year. He was in Holborn and St Pancras CLP until he was suspended by the Labour Party following his speaking at our meeting on Holocaust Memorial Day a year ago. So welcome back, Stephen, and over to you. Thank you very much for speaking this evening.
Well, hello, everybody. Just a quick correction. Actually, I wasn't suspended. I was warned that disciplinary actions would start if I spoke about my Holocaust experiences at an SLN meeting. And I then resigned in response to that. So
okay, thank you.
Wasn't suspended. Well, Hungary has a long tradition of anti-Semitism, and even way before the Holocaust. Hungary was very briefly a sort of socialist republic following the Russian Revolution, and that was put down by the right-wing Admiral Horthy, who became a regent thereupon of Hungary, and then very autocratic, racist right-wing ruler. And sort of white terror started, and then it settled down to just right-wing autocratic regime.
Something here. Yeah.
Hungary boasted the first racist laws in Europe, the so-called numerus clausus, which was brought in 1922, which limited the number of Jewish students at universities. And my father, as a result, had to do some of his studies in Prague, in the German University of Prague. War reached Hungary in 1944. Although Hungary joined the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union in 1941 as an ally in a minor role, Hungary didn't have a comparable powerful army, but they had all kinds of policing jobs and minor assisting fights along the Germans. But by 1944, it became fairly clear that, well, very clear that the war was lost for the German allies, and Horthy started negotiating secretly behind Hitler's back about a separate peace with the allies. The Germans got wind of that and invaded Hungary, which happened in March 44. And that date, March 1944, was a total disaster for the Jewish population, because shortly afterwards in came Eichmann, and a very serious reign of terror, and deportations started in Hungary. First wave of deportations and transportations were from the countryside. Budapest, which had a considerable Jewish population, was left to a much later stage. And but the Hungarian authorities, particularly the police, joined in with the Germans with great enthusiasm about the arrest and deportation and transportation of the Jews, so that about 400,000 people fell into that wave. Amongst them, many of my extended family, some of whom lived in Transylvania, some in the south of Hungary. Altogether, 15 members of my family were transported and died in Auschwitz, mostly in Auschwitz. One or two came back, which I'll come to later. As the Nazi regime had greater influence in Budapest, a much increased terror started against the Jews. And eventually there were a series of 3 or 4 Jewish laws, so racial laws against the Jews, enacted, and each one more severe than the next. They were limiting ownership rights, ability to practice professions, and later even to use public transport, to own radios or bicycles. And then we had to wear the yellow star. Regardless of age, I mean, I myself at age 7 was wearing a yellow star, although I didn't quite appreciate the significance of it. My parents did, on the other hand, and I was very much aware of their increased anxiety and so on. We were also concentrated in apartment buildings, which were a sort of archipelago of ghettos, because they were marked with a Star of David on the front, above the front or beside the front door, in a very large size. And only Jews were allowed to live in those buildings, and they were concentrated into it. And obviously this was all preparatory to an efficient system of deportation. My father was briefly called up into the labor force of the auxiliary Hungarian army, which was a rather humiliating kind of status. They were in uniform, but without insignia, and of course not given any weapons, and under guard. And they were destined to be used on the Eastern Front, digging trenches and clearing minefields, very often under a brutal Hungarian army officer in sort of rather sadistic circumstances, and starved. The survival rate was about 10%. So my father was briefly in a camp preparatory to being transported to the Eastern Front. And this is when an amazing action occurred of my mom and my aunt on false papers with Red Cross uniforms bluffed their way into one of these camps. They bribed the guards and they took out both my father and uncles to be brought back to our flats. There was no safety there either, but it was a lot better to be saved from that camp. Very briefly after that, the whole family entered one of the Zionist Kastner camps in Budapest, which was a kind of special camp negotiated with Eichmann, with the knowledge of the Nazi leadership, Himmler and Kaltenbrunner, with a highly controversial kind of collaborationist deal with the Nazis, whereby if they were transported to safety eventually through Bergen-Belsen, then they would be freed in Switzerland, provided that various munitions, trucks rather, and other useful army supplies were given plus cash to the Nazis in return. 2 transports already went, and my father was supposed to have been in the 3rd. And I myself was in that camp briefly, but then it was considered, the various rumors that it wasn't safe, and we left the camp. It was allowed to leave it, and back to the flats. It was then that I was taken up on false papers into these protected homes, so-called protected homes, of protected by, to some extent, by the Swiss Red Cross. Everybody on false papers, and we were supposed to have been escapees and orphans escaping the advancing Russian forces. It was actually a fairly dicey situation, because the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian fascist groups, which were positioned nearby, always suspected that this was all a false situation, and they tried to raid the place a number of times and had to be virtually fought off with the help of the Swiss Cross envoy, which was luckily successful a couple of times. But eventually the front line reached us, and so we had not only the danger of the Hungarian Nazi troops, the Arrow Cross, and the nearby German army, which was stationed all around us, but we were heavily bombed, and a number of times we had to change base because of that. A building was shot to pieces above our heads virtually, and we were all in the cellars, and luckily no children died. One adult did, though, above us. So I'd like to turn to explaining one or two events that highlight what fear and terror there was even before any arrest or transportation. A cousin of mine from the countryside was staying with my aunt briefly in Budapest, and it was decided that it was time she went home, taking a train to the south of Hungary. And my aunt Erzsi was taking her, this cousin Ilonka, to board the train to the station. They already bought the tickets, and they waved goodbye at the barriers, when my aunt discovered with her great horror that an Arrow Cross raiding party arrived and arrested my cousin just before she boarded the train. My aunt was at a little distance, and there's nothing she could do without endangering her own arrest. And I think this highlights the kind of mental anguish that some of these situations could create. To be completely paralyzed, unable to help, and having to witness the arrest of a loved one. This cousin Ilonka was immediately transported to Auschwitz, but she was a young 18-year-old, quite strong and put to work, and miraculously she survived and returned. In another situation, another boy who was at the same home as I was, I read later his story. He was a little bit older. He was 12 years old, and he was on a tram traveling in Budapest with his parents. The rule was that Jews could only travel on the last coach of a train or tram. That was part of the humiliating limitations of the repeated Jewish legislation. So there they were on a tram, crowded tram, and the boy at 12 was very interested in watching the driver, and moved forward to stand behind the driver in the front carriage to watch him working the levers. At one of the stops, Arrow Cross raiding party boarded the tram, and started asking for papers and arresting anybody who was Jewish. And so the parents fell into that net of arrest. And suddenly they had to make a decision whether to contact their own son a little distance further up, or just let him be, and possibly thereby saving him. So they made the quick decision not to contact him. They were arrested, taken to Auschwitz, and they never survived, never saw their son again, or his parents. And as I say, he eventually turned up in the same homes where I was on false papers, and he survived the war, but as an orphan.
A couple more minutes, please, Stephen.
I told this couple of stories to show the mental horror and the a different aspect of the Holocaust, which is not so immediately obvious, of having to make life defining decisions in complete ignorance and darkness, and bearing the consequences of it, and also the tremendous fear always in the air, and the systematic humiliation, wearing the yellow star and similar, and these awful legislation. And what came across to me in considering that is that this is entirely paralleled in Gaza today. They have the same racist attack on them, with the same kind of awful mental consequences that we also suffered during the Holocaust. And as a result, I find any linkage that Israel tries to make between the Holocaust of the Second World War and using it as any justification for what they are doing currently, their genocide, is completely abhorrent and disgusting.
Thank you, Stephen. A very sobering reminder of the horror, the terror, the fear, and that still goes on in parts of the world. So thank you, Stephen.
Okay.
Our next speaker, welcome, Ghada. I'm glad that you've arrived safely. Dr. Ghada Karmi is a British Palestinian doctor who was expelled by the Zionist militias from Palestine in 1948, where she initially lived in Jerusalem. Welcome, Ghada. It's good to see you again. Would you like to speak now, please? Just asking Ghada to unmute.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, hello, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this important gathering on this important day in European history. I really am very much, if I could put it like that, the odd man out here. I do not fit into the grouping of your speakers this evening. I am not Jewish, I am not European, and I do not have a family history of people from people who perished in the European concentration camps. So in that sense, I do not fit into this group. And I want to make the point, which is for me very, very important, that as a Palestinian, as an Arab, as a person from the Middle East, I have nothing to do with events that occurred in Europe during the Second World War, which were perpetrated by Europeans against other Europeans. And as such, that's what I meant by saying I have no place here. However, thinking like that, which I did for many, many years, meaning that it was honestly nothing to do with us as Arabs and Palestinians and so on, disguised for years for me the reality of the situation, which is that very unfairly and very tragically for the Palestinians, they are involved in this episode of European history. They are involved not through their own volition, not through their wish, but through the fact that a decision was made by Europeans to use the homeland of the Palestinian people, my homeland, Palestine, to become the place of repentance for what Europeans had done to Jews in Europe. That is the way I think that one has to regard this, because the Palestinian people, who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, were made to pay again and again, and from that day to this, for the crimes committed in Europe by Europeans against Europeans. If I tell you that my grandfather, for example, was a man who was, you might call, a landowner, but not in the feudal sense. He had agricultural lands. He and his family worked on those lands. He hired labor peasants to also work on those lands. Now, at that time, which just precedes the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which gave away my country to European Zionists, in the period before that, my grandfather, to give you an idea, was part of an agrarian society. That is what Palestine was. It was largely agrarian, small middle class, small educated class, but mostly really peasants and farmers. So when I look back and I think about my grandfather, my grandfather could no more have understood Zionism or Nazism or European history than flown to the moon. He would be completely out of his depth. It didn't mean anything to him. And that was the reality for most Palestinians. Yet, nevertheless, we were eventually dragged into having to learn about European history, having to learn about the background and origin of the people who usurped our country. And that is the connection. Now, as I grew older and understood that, and the unfairness of that the crimes committed in Europe were quite cynically paid for, made up for, by the use of a country and a people nothing to do with it, whose lives were ruined thereafter in that act of repentance. Now, when I began to understand that, I saw that the next stage of that imposition was the way that Palestinians were being turned into anti-Semites, an invented accusation against Palestinians that they were in fact anti-Semitic, and a big a drive to somehow make Palestinians guilty of the crimes that had been committed in Europe. Now, I know it sounds crazy, but that's actually what has happened and what is happening. And when you look at the way that censorship is exercised about Palestinians speaking, about Palestinians expressing their own history and their own grievances, you look at the way that European countries, principally Germany, have tried to silence the Palestinian voice. It's part of that. It's part of the attempt to drag in a people absolutely with nothing to do with the German Holocaust into a position in which they can also be blamed. So that is something that I have lived through, and all Palestinians have lived through. And I must tell you that for a while, it was so persuasive, it was so powerful, the invitation to try and draw in Palestinians into a very tragic story, but which has nothing to do with them. The pressure of that led, I must say, some of my fellow Palestinians to begin inquiring into Arab history, Islamic history. Is it true? Are we, i.e. Arabs, Muslims, are we guilty of perhaps being also Jew haters? And maybe there's something in it. An eminent scholar like Edward Said did work very hard at writing about and very much feeling tremendous sympathy for European Jews. And that's a human thing. That's a human thing. And on the human level, I, like all Palestinians, condemn what happened during the Second World War, and I sympathize with every fiber of my being with the victims of what happened. And that is actually the correct position for somebody like me. I want to go on just to explain that the really, really a tragic result of all this is that Palestinians have become the enemy. The thing is so insane that a piece of history, which happened 80 years ago, and is a really appalling piece of history, has been made to be utterly relevant to people, as I have said over and over again in this war, who have absolutely nothing to do. They've been dragged into this story. And the result is that they are suffering the effects of a new sort of hatred, a hatred of Palestinians who are somehow seen as anti-Semitic and who hate Jews and who refuse to allow the Jews to live in their country because they hate them. So hence you have the twisted narrative about what Hamas is really all about, what any Palestinian form of resistance is all about. That is why you have that. I want to end on 2 points. First, what a moment in history we are living through now. What an irony that the International Court of Justice has begun to investigate the allegation brought by South Africa that Israel is practicing genocide against the Palestinian people. What an irony that the people who justify their ownership of Palestine on the basis of a genocidal war on them are committing a genocidal war on the victims who were made to pay for those crimes. What an irony. And finally, friends, remember, Holocaust is at one level subjective. What the people of Gaza are going through now, for them, is a Holocaust. That is the Holocaust we also need to be marking today. I cannot explain to you adequately how badly I feel about the way that Palestinians have been treated and the tragic situation in Gaza today that I feel as a Palestinian. Not only is it objectively painful, but if you add to that the anger that I and all Palestinians feel that we should have been made to pay over and over again until today for the crimes of people living elsewhere against people living elsewhere. That is the anger that I feel.
Thank you, Ghada. We feel your anger and that illustration of the fact that the Palestinian people are continuously having to pay for the crimes of anti-Semites in Europe is in itself yet another tragedy. Thank you very much for expounding that so very clearly for us this evening. Next, and Ghada made reference to the South African case, and we appreciate the opportunity to have Ronnie Kasrils with us today, particularly in the light of South Africa's case against Israel's acts in Gaza and being brought to the International Court of Justice and their case being found plausible. Ronnie Kasrils is a former South African government minister and was a leading member of the African National Congress during the apartheid era. So, Ronnie, welcome this evening, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having me. Good evening to everybody. I want to first say to my dear friend Ghada, who I haven't seen for quite some time, that Ghada, you do have a place here. In fact, we couldn't have an event like this without a Palestinian. And you are not separate from us because we all feel we are Palestinians. And we hear this said all over the world. So we're with Palestine, we're with Gaza, we're with the West Bank, we're with the refugees, we're with the Palestinians living within the belly of the beast, within 48 Israel and the Palestinian diaspora. I'm very pleased to be with you all. And of course, I also had in mind the point Ghada was making. It was uppermost in my mind. What an irony that here we are on a very important day, which of course Zionists have weaponized Holocaust Day. And Stephen brought some of that home to us, as Ghada has. They've weaponized it. Tony Greenstein's written a brilliant book about this, as has many others. So we're together. And what South Africa has done at The Hague, at the IJC, is a blow. It's for Palestine, for all of Palestinians, but more than that, it's for humanity. It's the least that we could do, and we'll do everything possible to end the suffering of the Palestinians and the rule of the crazed Zionist gang and everything that Zionist stands for, because it's the most reprehensible racist doctrine that has brought about what has happened to so many Jews today who are bedeviled by this beast of Zionism, can't see out of that cocoon of theirs, are self-righteous with it, and it's absolutely appalling. So, dear Ghada, what you have to say strikes us all in the heart and in our brains, and we'll do everything possible to end the agony of the people of Gaza and the people of Palestine, everything possible that we can do. So, of course, here in South Africa, we are proud that we have played a role in bringing our position to the IJC, and the victory, this very historic and important victory, which adds to the tremendous solidarity which is being shown for the Palestinians, and the BDS movement, which is so important as a weapon, as we saw in relation to the overthrow of apartheid in South Africa. So this is a weapon for all of us. And the legal aspect, which the IJC ruling has brought about, is part of what global humanity and all the institutions, the United Nations, can bring to bear, and have to do so much more, because we know that this ruling, as vital, as important as it is, and how it pushes and holds Israel and Zionism to account in a corner, and the supporters from the US to the UK and the former colonial powers of Western Europe in particular. And here we are today, where we've heard, of course, from the raving criminal Netanyahu and his gang, their response to the IJC, this moral compass for the world. And what have we seen from those who make this all possible? United Kingdom, who we engaging with comrades today, the USA, Australia, Canada, already they have spat in the face of the IJC. They've spat in the face. And in what way? It is an absolute egregious scandal of the worst order that their response has been to withhold the funding that would keep the starving, hapless people of Gaza under Israeli bombs provided by Biden and company, and on the basis of an allegation by Israel, Zionist Israel, that a dozen workers of UNRWA have been somehow involved with Hamas. Again, this bogey man, Hamas, as we found in South Africa, the bogey man of the Swart Gevaar, the Black Peril, and the Roy Gevaar, the Red Peril of communism in the Cold War days. Now it's Hamas. A dozen people of 13,000 working for UNRWA at a time when it's vital to bring in the supplies to keep the Gazan people alive in relation to everything that they face. and the humanitarian needs of food and water and medicine. These dreadful, despicable countries, the UK, the poodle of the USA, Canada, Australia, Italy, by the way, ganging up and spitting in the faces of humanity. It is absolutely disgusting and revolting. It leaves one speechless, and it shows us what we have to do in terms of all the weapons that we have, including such an important ruling at the IJC, to build up global pressure and using the weapon of boycott, divestment, and sanctions in all these countries in the first place, to put on all the pressure that we can against these dreadful countries such as the USA, the governments of those countries I've mentioned and others, and to stop them through global people's power and in every possible way. I want to, in invoking the South African experience, and Tony asked me to speak about it. I don't want to take up too much time, but just to remind us all that it was that world solidarity that forced sanctions against South Africa, even by the USA and Britain and France and so on. It was Israel who kept breaking those sanctions, who provided this racist, fascist South African country. So we could see where Israel was coming from, where Zionists had created that beast, providing the apartheid regime, even with the nuclear know-how, including other weapons, ships and planes and so on, in terms of the struggle against the people of South Africa, against apartheid, and the people of Southern Africa, all the neighboring states, in the exact same way that Israel wages war against its neighbors on behalf of Western imperialism to keep the Middle East under the control of Western imperialism through this beast that has been created by Balfour and the USA from the early part of the last century right through to this day, 48, 67, and the dreadful genocide that is underway, not only against the people of Gaza who are in the front line, but the people of the West Bank. And I don't need to go into the figures, it'll take up time and everybody knows that. But how did we overcome? We had what we called 4 pillars of struggle. In the first primary place is the struggle of the people, a political struggle with political aims and objectives, and the moral high ground, reinforced by underground struggle, a clandestine struggle, armed struggle, and I want to come to Hamas and the resistance in a moment, and of course, this vital ingredient of international solidarity. We saw it with Vietnam as well, how international solidarity helped them to overcome the Americans and how it helped South Africa to overcome apartheid. So it can help to overcome the struggle against Zionism as it exists, and in terms of that, to reinforce the struggle of the people of Palestine. Let me end by just drawing the point about October the 7th and the point about the Palestinian resistance. Let's be very, very wary about the invocation of terrorism, of worst types of butchery, of the kind of evidence that Israel, supported by the USA and the UK and others, without question, without evidence. What is it really about? If we're to get down to what actually happened on the 7th of October, the only way to do it is with an independent inquiry. Just recall what that woman, Yasmin Horrit, had to say right at the very beginning. She was then whisked away. But it struck me within a day or two when there was an interview with her that went worldwide and then was snuffed out by Israeli radio and TV, when she said that the majority of people at the music festival and then at Be'eri, where the tanks and the helicopters shot missiles into the crowd without caring about Israeli Jews and other people from Thailand and elsewhere being butchered on the spot. What actually took place? Let's not fall for the line that the Israeli Defense Force and the Netanyahu's put before us, because I'm absolutely sure we will find, and it's already coming out even through other Israeli sources, that there's been huge exaggeration. We know that there's no truth to the fact, no evidence that 40 babies were beheaded and such like the rapes of women, whatever way they trick us in terms of the videos that they might be projecting. I wanted to make that as a penultimate point, because I'm quite aware of the time factor. I want to say this, as someone who was born second generation South Africa, with my grandparents on both sides, having come from Lithuania and Latvia, and I grew up amongst the Zionist community. Thank goodness my parents weren't Zionist. They weren't political. They simply said to me, respect everybody, do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. That was imbibed. And fortunately for myself, I became involved with the ANC. It helped me break, Ghada, totally from the kind of past that makes you feel you were not really one of us here today. And by the struggle of the South African people, the ANC, the Communist Party, which I joined, the struggle which us socialists find, that it's not to remain in our cocoons that we're born into, but that we're part of humanity. I became part of the struggle for South Africa, and I don't regard myself as that cocoon that I came from. I'm more part of humanity. And the Zionists will attack me and say this is all cosmopolitan nonsense, etc., etc. But this is what it's about. And I'm very pleased to see the young Jews today who are answering their consciousness, their call, their conscience in terms of what humanity is all about. It's more than, of course, these Jews who stand up, not in our name. It's all of us. And what we must do in terms of winning this battle, as we won it against apartheid South Africa, and we will win it for sure, because this is the moral high ground against apartheid Israel and those imperialists who support it. But bear in mind that resistance and armed resistance is sanctified in international law. When a people have no possibility of making change through peaceful means alone, they have the right to answer arms in hand. And for me, my final point, I've been a minister of intelligence. I've been a solidarity activist. That's where I met Ghada 25 years ago or so in Lebanon, where we were together teaching people about solidarity. And from that point of view, what will definitely work as a formula will be a struggle for a fully democratic society in Palestine. I don't go for the two-state solution, as my government, by the way, still does, but I believe they'll have to change. And it's a struggle, as South Africa was, for a democratic unitary state where people are equal. And those four pillars of struggle, the people struggle, reinforced by armed struggle, underground struggle, and international solidarity is what can bring it about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, for that call to humanity, for equality, and just reminding me there are various comments in the chat about the Hannibal directive referenced in Ronnie's explanation about the events of the 7th of October, and reminding us that the struggle continues. And on the UNRWA action today, it was the US, UK, Australia, Italy, and Canada voted to pull funding from UNRWA. Interestingly, since the ICJ findings yesterday, it seems that they are punishing the agency, trying to mitigate the worst of Israel's aggression in Gaza. There's another comment in the chat about funding, people making donations to UNRWA and in order to help mitigate this drastic action by those Western imperialist nations. So on then to our next speaker, we welcome Suzanne Weiss. Suzanne was born to immigrant Jews in Paris in 1941 and found refuge with a farm family between 1943 and 1945. Suzanne lost her parents in the war and then was adopted by a New York family in 1950. Suzanne has been active throughout her life in a variety of social justice movements. Suzanne's written a memoir, Holocaust Resistance, My Journey, published by Fernwood in October 2019. So welcome this evening, Suzanne, and over to you.
Did I unmute myself?
Yes, you did. We can hear you and we
Thank you very much,
see you.
Esther. Thank you very much, Esther, and thank you very much, Tony, for inviting me to this absolutely wonderful panel. I'm learning so much, and I agree so much, and everything touches my heart, and I'm so glad to be part of this. I'm an activist, and I'm speaking as an activist. I was 1 year old in Paris, France, when Hitler Nazis occupied the city in 1942. My mother was seized. She died in Auschwitz. I was rescued by the Jewish resistance, which was organized as a military force and also as a social justice organization. I was saved by the solidarity of many individuals and by a whole population who believed in humanity. During the war, I was hidden by people in Auvergne in the south of France. When Nazism was smashed in 1945, the Jewish resistance protected me in their orphanages. As a survivor, I learned that the solidarity of the peoples of the world against racism was decisive in defeating Nazism. Today, it is evident that the world's solidarity against racism is crucial to the victory of the Palestinian people. In 1945, the Nazi mass murder of the Jews was largely hidden, unknown to the world's population. The Nazis attempted to conceal their crimes as World War II ended. Today, Israel's massacres are carried out publicly with impunity, and we all see on media the horror of Israel's depopulation of Gaza and the West Bank. Courage and determination is all the Palestinian people have. We support their choice to work with forces who defend their goal with means other than sticks and stones. Since October 7th of last year, the world's people have demanded that our governments end this maniacal injustice, but the self-righteous governments snub and rebuff the millions repeatedly demonstrating in defense of the Palestinians. These governments ignore the thousands of letters and petitions and court appeals begging them to stop bankrolling Israel's massacres and to cease fire immediately. We of conscience who say never again for all humanity ask, how do we break the blood-soaked friendships of our governments, the corporations and organizations that trade with the Israeli racist government? We, the ordinary people, feel the intense obligation and urgency to counter racist governmental complicity. They punish those who stand for Palestinian solidarity, audacious individuals and groups like Tony Greenstein and his fellow resistors in Palestine Action. Their campaign to shut down Elbit was courageous. Similar actions have taken place in Canada with comparable results. We must continue our world united defense for Palestinians with insistence for ceasefire. How do we up the ante? How do we make our defense more effective? It's time to seriously study the tools of boycott, divestments, and sanction, BDS. The mass movement can organize and use the power of their numbers to strike collectively at targeted points of production and at the points of profits. I've been asked if I experience the sting of hatred, that is, if I've experienced the hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism after the Second World War. Yes, I have felt the sting of racist hatred throughout my life. But in the context of today's Israeli war against the Palestinians, some people misconstrue Judaism, the religion we have been born into for Zionism, the racist political program of Israeli apartheid. The Israeli occupation, the systematic war of genocide, is done in the name of Judaism. This is an unforgivable crime against the Jewish people. It is also a violation of the solidarity sought by the peoples of the world. It is a violent assault against the solidarity between Muslims, Christians, Jews, and the many others who desire love, equality, and peace on earth. On another level, Israel's apartheid governments and its supporters have been waging an open global parallel war. It is an attempt by Israel to change the meaning of anti-Semitism to prohibit criticism of the apartheid program. This parallel war by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, is to silence the Palestinians and erase them from history. Attacks are students, educators in high schools and universities, news reporters and activists who are defending our democratic rights as well as Palestinians. BDS should also be considered in this area of struggle. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this important commemoration of the Jewish Holocaust. Together, we affirm our determination against racism, against complicity, and in defense of Palestinian freedom. In victory, we can truly say, never again.
Thank you, Suzanne. Important to remind us all that making it sound as if Jewish people are responsible for the actions of the Israelis is itself an anti-Semitic crime, and also hearing your show of solidarity for people oppressed everywhere. Thank you very, very much. Our next speaker this evening is Ilan Pappe. Professor Pappe is the foremost historian of the Nakba that we've heard about already this evening, and whose publications include the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. I'm delighted you can join us this evening, Ilan, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Esther. Thank you, Tony, for organizing this important webinar. And it's a great honor to be with Stephen, Susan, Rada, and Ronnie and Tony on this panel. I would like to address one aspect that I think is appropriate to discuss on that particular day in our calendar. And I discuss this both as a historian who deals with this issue, but also as someone born to a family who lost on both sides many of its members in the Holocaust, both in Germany and in Poland. And this has to do with the abuse of the Holocaust memory and the way that abuse is manipulated and exploited over the years to justify the Israeli policies of elimination against the Palestinians. I want to pay tribute to one or two Israeli critical scholars who were brave enough to dig out for the first time evidence and documentation and provided an analysis of how Israel manipulates the Holocaust memory in order to justify its criminal policies towards the Palestinians. I should say that this is really a project of inquiry that exposes two sides to this connection between the Holocaust and the Zionist colonization of Palestine. There's one bit to which I would not address. I would not address in any detail, but I just want to mention it, which is the very important link that was in the early 1930s between the Zionist movement and the Nazis, who shared all kinds of interests, and among them, the one interest that connects today anti-Semites around the world with Zionism, and that's the wish not to see the Jews anywhere in the world, but in one place. So you can be a very strong supporter of Israel and a very anti-Semitic racist person. The two are not mutually exclusive. But I think more important is the way Israel uses for domestic consumption, but also for external consumption, not the Holocaust, in order to justify actions against the Palestinians. In fact, it began already in 1948 during the Nakba, when you study the kind of indoctrination that was taking place among Zionist troops on the eve of attacking Palestinian villages or towns, attacks that quite often led to massacres, always led to expulsion and ethnic cleansing. Always the commanders stressed in front of these Zionist troops that they're actually not fighting Palestinians or villagers or town dwellers, women, men, and children, but they're actually fighting the new Nazis. and that was a very important part of the indoctrination, the Nazification of the Palestinian, which is another form of advocating dehumanization of the Palestinian so that you could then enact policies of expulsion and extermination of the Palestinians. This continued throughout the years. One good example is that in the Encyclopedia of the Holocaust in Israel, which is a book that exists in every household, the second and largest entry in this encyclopedia after Hitler is Haj Amin al-Husseini. Now, Haj Amin al-Husseini had, like so many politicians in the Arab world, seeking alliances against Britain with whoever opposed Britain. But to put him in the same role as Hitler is reminiscent of the horrible lie that Benjamin Netanyahu brought with him in one of his visits to Britain, when he claimed that Haj Amin al-Husseini is the one who suggested to Hitler to exterminate the Jews. He saw Hitler for 1 minute and a half. They didn't have much time to talk about anything. And it was something that is part of that manipulation in order to create this false, totally false connection between the Nazi regime and its extermination policies and the anti-colonialist resistance of the Palestinians to the Zionist colonization of Palestine. Now, that kind of Nazification continued afterwards. I think many of you would remember how Menachem Begin in 1982 compared Yasser Arafat in the bunker of Beirut to Hitler in the bunker of Berlin in the last days of the Second World War. And that again was in order to justify not only the search for Arafat, but to justify the brutal and ruthless 1982 bombardment of Beirut during the first Israeli invasion, comparing it to the British need to bombard cities in Germany in order to fight a horrible and unimaginable enemy. Now, beyond the 1982 comparison, we are aware that this kind of discourse and manipulation continued in Israel in this century. You can find it in the Israeli textbook for children. You can find it in the website of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. You can find it in the speeches of Israeli diplomats. And what we have seen in the last 3 months, like everything else about what happened in the last 3 months, that everything we knew about what Israel is doing, either its policies on the ground, either the way it manipulates the Holocaust memory, the way it fabricates history, everything it has done until the 7th of October is now augmented, is now being done in even a higher level of intensity. And that is true also about the fabrication, the manipulation, and the lies. The way that Israeli leaders were trying to portray the Hamas as a Nazi organization, and the way that they were trying to portray what happened on the first half of the day on the 7th of October as a Holocaust of the Jews is an insult to the Holocaust memory. And a lot of Holocaust survivors in Israel felt quite uneasy about these comparisons, but they were silenced very, very shortly after they opened their mouths on Israeli radio when they tried to protest and to ask that this would not be at all contextualized with the Holocaust. The idea that whatever you think of what happened on the 7th of October, and I agree with Ronnie, we still don't know the full details of how everything happened and what happens. But whatever the worst case scenario that one has for the 7th of October, to compare the deaths of 1,000 or so people to the industrial genocide of 6 million Jews is the worst kind of abuse of the Holocaust memory, and it is done by the Israeli Zionist leaders themselves. Similarly, and I was thinking about it when Stefan was talking about the yellow star, which also my parents had to wear, to appear in the United Nations with the Star of David on the chest of the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. Either the man is an idiot, which is possible from all we know about him, or he's not an idiot, which is even worse, which means that he's really trying to manipulate a symbol of the worst kind of anti-Semitism to the action of a resistance movement against the brutal colonization and oppression of the Palestinian people. But this did not deter, this stupid act, or rather cynical act, did not deter the Israelis to continue. And the main point, and with this I would end, and I think this is so important on this particular day to mention it. All over the years, Israel is always using a pretext for the worst kind of actions against the Palestinians. Why does it use a pretext? Because it believes that the pretext provides a shield of immunity in the West. Namely, this is a democracy that defends itself. This is a democracy that retaliates. This is a democracy that is a Jewish democracy that fights against the new Nazis. I don't know if you heard, and I hope you don't do it too often, but if you would have listened to Netanyahu today, which I would never suggest, but sometimes you have to if you want to be on top of things. He today talked again about, in response to the ICJ ruling of the Palestinians as the new Nazis. So it's very fresh, this kind of manipulation. But the pretext here is very important. And it doesn't matter whether the pretext is to say we have to do what we do because we are facing the new Nazis, or we have to do what to do because we are facing a branch of the Islamic State, or an arm of the Iranian octopus. It doesn't matter. The pretext is important because Israel doesn't want to talk about the context. And we have seen what happened to those who talked about the context of the 7th of October, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, who dared to say that what happened on the 7th of October didn't happen in a vacuum. The context is so important because the context is that Israel is a settler colonial state, and like all settler colonial states, it's based on the elimination of the native. Here, the natives are the Palestinians. And this eliminatory policies that came to a certain peak in 1948 with the Nakba are being attempted again. And the pretext is far less important than the context. And the context is that Israel is using that the last 3 months to complete what it has not completed in 1948. And of course, all of this will not happen if, as Ronnie already said, if not were for the shameful position of the British government, the American administration, and European governments. And I must say, I know that a lot of people seem to be happy with the ICJ ruling. I'm not. I think the ICJ showed cowardness, a lack of moral stance, unlike the South African government, when it did not call for a ceasefire. Not calling for a ceasefire and asking a state like Israel, or believing that the state of Israel will report back within 30 days that it is trying to tame the genocidal policies, is ridiculous. Israel, even if it does, which I doubt, hand over such a report, would use the 30 days and would work towards continuing the genocide with the knowledge that the ICJ has given it 30 days to continue its work. I don't think that was the intention of the ICJ, but that's my final point. What is so interesting, among even good people and basically positive institutions, they somehow think that what is important is the message that they convey to Israel and not how these messages are interpreted by Israel. Some people who showed solidarity with the victims of Israel on the 7th of October are not bad people. but they didn't understand that the message of solidarity was understood by Israel as a carte blanche to genocide the Palestinians in Gaza. In a similar way, what the Israelis understand from the ICJ ruling is that they got a slap on the hand, yes, but all in all, there is no pressure from the ICJ, as there's no pressure for anyone else, apart from the civil society in the global south, to stop the genocide in Gaza, which really means that it's up to us in the civil society in the world, of course, and up to the liberation movement on the ground to double and triple our efforts, because we cannot rely either on the governments or on international law, unfortunately, to stop the genocide of the Palestinians. The only good news is that the 7th of October exposed something we knew before, that there are such wide cracks in this construction of Zionism that we are definitely seeing the beginning of the end of this project. Zionism is towards its last phase. It's a very dangerous moment because it is very cruel and ruthless, because it's fighting for its life, but there is a light in the end of the tunnel. There is a dawn shining at the end of this dark night. It is going to collapse and implode both from within and eventually with the pressure from the outside. We just have to wait to make sure that the void it leaves behind is going to be filled with a constructive alternative to the Zionist state, and that we are not going to face a long period of chaos as happened in other places where regimes disintegrated but were not immediately replaced by something more hopeful for the people who live there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilan, for that clear analysis, and also the exhortation that it's up to us. Thank you. Our final speaker this evening is Tony Greenstein, which I think most of you will know that among Tony's many achievements, he's recently authored this book, Zionism During the Holocaust, which I encourage all of you to obtain and read. Tony, you're our final speaker. Welcome, and over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Esther, and a welcome to everyone who's come here. There's over 300 people who've attended, which I think is absolutely great. My first comment, and I agree with all the contributions, I think they've been brilliant. My first comment is actually to Ghada when she said that she didn't really belong here. On the contrary, you more than anyone belong at this meeting. And the reason is very simple, that without the way that Israel has manipulated the Holocaust narrative and the conclusions to have been drawn from it, it would not have been able to get away with what it has done. It has mercilessly exploited the Holocaust, the tragedy not only, of course, of the Jews, but the Gypsies, the disabled, gays, and so on, in order to pursue its murderous course of action. And I used to recoil when people compared what happens or what's happened to the Palestinians to the Jews and others in Europe, because I thought talk of genocide and Holocaust was hyperbole. But today we can see the actions of Israel in Gaza, and they are really no different from what the Nazis did in Warsaw and its demolition of the Warsaw Ghetto. And yet, despite that, of course, the West gives them support, and that should be on their conscience if they had a conscience. It's also, I think, ironic that the judgment of the International Court of Justice, for all its faults and failings, and I agree with Ilan that it showed cowardice in not calling for a ceasefire. It knew its place in a sense. It didn't want to challenge the US administration, but it is ironic that that was delivered one day before Holocaust Memorial Day. And just a word about Holocaust Memorial Day, because this was really a recent invention in Britain. I think it was in about 1999 that the Blair government instituted such a day. And yet it only commemorates or remembers the genocides which have taken place since the Nazi Holocaust. So it doesn't include all the genocide from the African slave trade to what happened in the Congo, what happened in Southwest Africa in its remit. And I think that is also a mark of shame. It was Norman Finkelstein who first coined the term Holocaust industry. And what we have around us today is that Holocaust industry. I wish to quote an Israeli historian, Boaz Evron, when he said about what's called Holocaust awareness, which is what they are dedicated to, that this is an official propagandist indoctrinating, churning out slogans and a false view of the world, the real aim of which is not at all an understanding of the past, but a manipulation of the present. And that is exactly what we are facing today. And we see that in the institution that Israel created, Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, which is ironically situated literally a stone's throw from the massacre at Deir Yassin. And Danny Dayan, who is the chairman of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum, was asked to condemn what was happening in Gaza and to join the calls for a ceasefire. And Dayan refused. And that's not surprising, firstly, because Danny Dayan was a former member, he stood for the Knesset for Techiyah, a right-wing settler party. He is himself a settler. And Yad Vashem has never once condemned or criticized Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. It has refused to draw any universal lessons at all from what happened to the Jews in the Holocaust. And that is why I think we must treat it for what it is, a propaganda museum. And it's not surprising. Tom Segev, in his book, The Seventh Million, described how the idea for Yad Vashem arose. And it arose, the first proposal to establish it came in September 1942 from Mordechai Shenhavi at a board meeting of the Jewish National Fund. This was when most of Europe's Jews were still alive. And it was seen as the very last opportunity, and I'm quoting, to score any financial success. In other words, the proposal to establish a memorial to the Jewish dead in the Holocaust was proposed while they were still living. And that, I think, symbolizes the utter cynicism of the Zionists towards the Holocaust. And the question is, why do we remember the Holocaust? What is the purpose of this? And I think for most of us, it's symbolized in the slogan, never again. Never again what happened to the Jews and others should happen to any other people. But for the Zionists, it has a particular meaning, namely that never again applies solely to the Jews. It applies to nobody else. There are no anti-racist lessons to be drawn from the Holocaust, no lessons about the evils of colonialism and where it leads. On the contrary, the Holocaust is the justification for everything that Israel does. And it reminds me of an article that Gideon Levy, one of the few decent Israeli journalists, wrote in Haaretz. He wrote this about the fact that Israel sends every year thousands of Israeli teenagers to Auschwitz, not in order that they can draw the necessary anti-racist conclusions, but quite the opposite, to instill in them a kind of militaristic nationalism. And Levy wrote, I have yet to hear a single teenager come back from Auschwitz and say that we mustn't abuse others the way we were abused. There has yet to be a school whose pupils came back from Birkenau, which is where the killings took place in the gas chambers, straight to the Gaza border, saw the barbed wire fence and said never again. The message is always the opposite. Gaza is permitted because of Auschwitz, and that is the lesson that Zionism has drawn from the Holocaust. But for us, as Ilan Pappe has pointed out, there has been a consistent attempt to paint the Palestinians as the new Nazis, and that is something we have to resist. And there was also outrage when South Africa referred Israel to the International Court. They said, how can you do this, given that we have suffered from the Holocaust? And my response to them is very clear, that racism is not a biological property of a particular people. Any group of people, whatever their ethnicity, given the right set of circumstances, can perpetrate a genocide. And that has been true throughout history. The victims can also become perpetrators. And that is what we are seeing in Israel today. Israel didn't come out of the Holocaust. The Zionist settler colonial movement began at the end of the 19th century. But nonetheless, the Holocaust has shaped Israel and its narrative, because, of course, immediately after the Second World War, it played down the Holocaust because it gave the wrong lessons. But in the wake of the Eichmann trial, then Israel wholeheartedly adopted the Holocaust narrative and used it for their own purposes. And it's quite interesting, I think, that Germany intervened or added its support for Israel at the International Court, much to the outrage, I have to say, of Namibia, Southwest Africa, because Germany has been in the forefront of the attack on Palestine solidarity, including Jewish anti-Zionist activists. And I have to say that when Germany supports Israel at the ICJ, when Germany gives support to the Israeli state, it is actually following in the footsteps of Nazi Germany itself. People don't remember, and this is partly why I wrote my book. People do not remember that during the Hitler period, because the Holocaust began in 1941, Hitler came to power in January 1933. During that period, the Nazis were the favored children of the Nazis. They alone were singled out amongst the Jewish community. Don't forget, the German Jewish community was overwhelmingly non or anti-Zionist. The Zionists comprised just 2% of German Jews. And they were the ones that the Nazis oriented to, because they too understood the importance of race and eugenics and biology. And in 1935, the man who's called the engineer of the final solution, Reinhard Heydrich, he issued a directive stating, and I quote, "The activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that are engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interest of the National Socialist state leadership. They are not to be treated with that strictness that it is necessary to apply to members of the so-called German Jewish organizations, brackets assimilationists." And similarly, in May of 1935, Schwarzkopf, which was the paper of the SS, wrote that the Zionists adhere to a strict racial position, and by emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state. The assimilation-minded Jews, that is 98% of the German Jewish community, deny their race and insist on their loyalty to Germany, or claim to be Christians, because they have been baptized in order to subvert National Socialist principles. And I should add that Nazi Germany introduced a quite novel concept, because feudal anti-Semitism, people like Martin Luther, always believed that once you convert someone who is Jewish, that was an end to the matter. They were Christian and that was that. But for the Nazis, it didn't matter if you converted, you were still Jewish by race. And so you had the new phenomena of German Christians, and the same, of course, in Hungary and other parts of Europe. They too would go to the gas chambers. And it reminded me when the campaign, Israel's attack on Gaza, began really with the statement of Yoav Gallant, Israel's defense minister, or we might say Israel's war minister. People might remember what he said. He said there will be no food, there will be no water, there will be no medicine, there will be no fuel. And he described the Palestinians as human animals. And this recalled to me what Heinrich Himmler, who in essence, the chief of the SS, which was in charge of the implementation of the final solution. It was in a speech to senior SS officers, generals, in a speech in Poznan, which is now in Poland, on the 4th of October, 1943, when he praised the Nazis as the only people in the world to have taken, quote, a decent attitude towards animals, and who would be equally decent towards human animals. So this is really what the attack on Gaza is. It is no different in terms of its narrative, in terms of its attitude, in terms of the determination of the Zionists to ethnically cleanse it from what the Nazis did. Because we should remember, the Nazi program in 1933 was not extermination, it was not genocide, it was ethnic cleansing. They wanted Jews to leave Germany. And that is exactly similar to the attitude of the Zionists today. And of course, if you can't get ethnic cleansing, then you indulge in genocide. And that's exactly what Israel is doing today.
Are you nearly finished, Tony?
Yeah, if you can give me another couple of minutes or so.
Will do. Okay.
The reason why I wrote my book is precisely because I think we have to, if you like, challenge the narrative of the Zionists over their use of anti-fascism, over their use of what happened during the Holocaust. And I think it's worthwhile to remember that when the Nazis came to power, the only section of the Jewish community which effectively welcomed them and saw in them something that could be exploited was the Zionist movement. And for instance, Berl Katznelson, who was in a sense a deputy to Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister, described the rise of Hitler as an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will have. And Ben-Gurion himself was even more optimistic. The Nazi victory would become a fertile force for Zionism. And they weren't the only ones. Noah Lucas, who was a critical Zionist historian, he wrote, and I quote, "As the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler in all of their horror must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of Zionism." So we saw, for instance, when it was very clear after Kristallnacht, the German pogrom, the Nazi pogrom against the Jews in November 1938, what the intentions of the Nazis were, namely extermination if necessary. And the British government agreed to the immigration of 10,000 Jewish children to Britain. I mean, I say this was quite unique. What was the attitude of the Zionists? Did they welcome it? No, on the contrary. Their attitude was if they couldn't go to Palestine, they should not go anywhere. And Ben-Gurion made a famous quote, and it's in his official biography by Shabtai Tabeth. And he said, and I quote, "If I knew it was possible or would be possible to save all the children in Germany by bringing them over to England, and only half of them by transporting them to the land of Israel, then I would opt for the second alternative. For we must weigh not only the life of these children, but also the history of the people of Israel." And I think it's important, therefore, to remind ourselves of the record of Zionism during the Holocaust. Alone amongst, if you like, the Jewish people, it saw only advantages in what was happening. And that's why they actually actively obstructed rescue attempts to places that were not, that weren't Palestine. And that is in my book. But I want to end, in a sense, on an optimistic note, because like Ilan Pappe, I think we are witnessing the beginning of the end of Zionism. It may be bloody, but I think Israel has a limited shelf life, and we should look forward to its demise. A Jewish state is a monstrosity, just like the Christian ethno-nationalist states in Europe, which took part in the Holocaust eagerly, were a monstrosity. The only solution in Palestine is a democratic secular state. A two-state solution means the state of Israel would remain. It is, in essence, an apartheid solution. So sorry for having gone over time, and I look forward to the questions and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So we're going to bring all the panel back now. We've got some questions in the Q&A, and I'd like to pose those to the panel in the first instance. So if Matthew, you can bring everybody, the whole panel back, or do you want me to help with that? So that we can see everybody. So we've got 3 questions in the Q&A which are linked and that relate to the single democratic state that Tony's just referenced, and it's come up quite a lot in the chat as a solution to the conflict and the marginalization of the Palestinian people. So we've got a comment from Shabir: "Is there any prospect of the path of South Africa working towards a single democratic state possible in Israel, Palestine?" We've got comments from Marie Lynham in the chat about her doubting that the Israeli leadership would ever accept a democratic republic secular state. We've got a question linked from David Kenvin. "It's apparent to me the only way the ICJ ruling can be enforced is if we do it," which is what Ilan said. It's up to all of us. "Our governments will not act unless we put pressure on them. The way to do this is to do the same as we did with apartheid South Africa, impose a BDS campaign. Do you agree?" And then a comment from Leonard Shapiro to Ilan: "I think the ICJ judgment serves a very important purpose for the global solidarity movement, including BDS, to help Palestinians towards overcoming apartheid and the establishment of a democratic state for all. Do you see this an important outcome of the ICJ judgment?" So can I ask our panel, I mean, I wonder whether Ronnie and Ilan in the first instance, and maybe Tony and others, have a response to that.
To that you mean
those comments?
ICJ?
The comment? ICJ linking it to,
yeah.
Well, how do we enforce it in the first instance, but also linking that to the ultimate outcome, which should be a single democratic state?
Yeah, let me put it this way. I don't underestimate the symbolic importance of the way that ICJ, first of all, recognized the right of South Africa to submit its demand, and that it also substantiated almost all the facts that the South African team had brought to the court, and even used the same language as the South African delegation did, or the team used. I think in the long run, this would be an important landmark in the sense of changing the discourse about Israel. However, I don't think that was the main, and Ronnie will talk after me, will correct me. I don't think this was the main motive for the South African appeal to the ICJ. I think the South African government genuinely believed that there is a genocide taking place in Gaza. And it was not interested in the philosophical debate whether it is genocide or not. What the South Africans wanted is the ICJ to, and they said it very clearly, to rule that Israel has to stop immediately the genocide or bear the consequences. And this, unfortunately, is something the ICJ refused to do. In fact, I remember exactly the wording of the president of the ICJ. She said that they accept the allegations made by the South African team, but they do not accept the operative side of, or the operative measures that the South African demanded. That is this is a surrender to the global North treatment of Israel with a slap on the hand, but without any significant practical measure to stop the genocide. Israel can live with symbolic allegations. It would find it much harder to do what it does if it will face real sanctions. And real sanctions are not coming out in the next month from the ICJ. So yes, we as a civil society have a lot to do to move in the BDS from the B and D, the boycott and divestment, to the S, the sanctions. Ronnie can tell us, as he told me once, how it also happened in the case of South Africa. It was not immediately an action of governments in the solidarity movement. It began in the civil society. It took a while before governments joined the civil action of boycott. But I think we are moving towards that, but we need to accelerate the pace, because this is an Israel, unlike any Israel we knew before. This is an Israel led by Messianic Zionist Jews who have no inhibition, and nothing would stop them for not only genociding the people of Gaza, but to doing the same in the West Bank if we don't stop them. This has to be clearly said, and I'm saying it as someone who knows the Israeli beast from within. This is not a paranoid reaction. This is not someone who wants to over-dramatize a certain action. I know the mood in the state. I hear the people. I hear the leaders of the political system. I hear the military commanders, and I don't remember ever feeling so frightened of what the next year holds for the Palestinians in particular, but even for dissident Jews like myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. I'll hand over to Ronnie now also to respond to that. It's up to us.
Sorry, Esther, you're referring to me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So there are 2 points that I'd like to make. I tend to agree with Ilan's pessimism to some degree in terms of Israel and its backers just refusing to take any action in terms of the ICJ. And we've already seen that. I've alluded to that. However, take note of what our foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, had to say when she tried to interpret. She did a damn good job. And she said, of course, we wanted to see them call for a ceasefire. And that's where there's been disappointment. And we're hearing this straight out of Gaza. how depressed people there are feeling, because for them, they were regarding a positive finding at the ICJ as one which would miraculously overnight stop the bombings, etc. But Ali Abu Nema of the Electronic Intifada has also entered the debate, and his Ilan quite positive if we consider the statement he's made about the difference between a ceasefire in relation to a military conflict and the question of calling on Israel to abide by the genocidal preliminary findings. So I think from that point of view, it does link us to what we can do internationally in putting pressure on our dreadful governments through our actions. And we did see some of this, coming to my second point and the other question, which was how, in fact, South Africa managed to see the change. So we can't underestimate in the long term, not the short term, although bear in mind what people have said there about the, I think Tony and Ilan, about the incredible contradictions that we're seeing taking place within the Israel political class and within the United States. These kind of contradictions can lead to very dramatic acceleration, and it's international solidarity, people's power from the grassroots that can add to it. So in South Africa, we saw a slow erosion, and the economic sanctions played a huge role in terms of the political economic class of white supremacy, of Zionist supremacy in Israel as the corollary to South Africa. And for a time, a lot of us in the movement, Mandela, where he was so unusual, being imprisoned on the one hand, but on the other hand, believing that there would be this break amongst the South African ruling class. I mean, the South African Communist Party, and I was at a Congress we had in Cuba in 1989, we still felt the only way was an insurrectionary overthrow of the system. And we said, well, negotiations could be a smaller part. Of course, there are big differences between South Africa and Israel, Zionist Israel, and that's the demographic factor. You know, in South Africa, the whites were 10%, that was all. So that's a very big factor which relates to why Zionism has placed the demographic factor as its top order of things. But in the end, it's not just demographic. So the isolation of Israel, Zionist Israel, that colonial settler apartheid state, that can create big, big cracks and force change. And I know we would stand back and say, well, these crazed Israelis, who 95% or more believe purely in the racial supremacy factor. It was there within white South Africa, Zionist Jews amongst them, by the way. The Jews who were against were very, very small. I'm just adding that as an aside. So we're dealing with a 360-degree process, including the global factor. What happens if the USA, through its own specific interests, and both political and economic, and the Arab world, if only the Arab world would behave like the African states did in support of us, but these ifs are questions which can change. And I'll end by saying it changes under the huge dynamic of resistance, which is why I have a particular view of Palestinian resistance. But we do put at the head the political factor and political leadership. So from that point of view, there's an optimism which I feel, because I agree with what has been said, that Zionism is finished and done, and the crisis is really there. The Palestinians, the Gazan people, the West Bank, the longer they hold on and they have that samut, the longer that happens, the more Zionism dies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. So that Zionism is on its last legs, and of course we haven't mentioned the action against the Houthis either. So there's a whole wave of actions that Western imperialism is enforcing in order to try to keep it on its last
And the
legs.
Houthis are heroes. The Houthis are heroes.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yes.
Well,
In solidarity. So before we go, we've only a few minutes left. I want to invite Tony, Ghada, Suzanne, and Stephen to make final comments if they wish to. We only have a few minutes left. So Ghada, would you like to make some closing comments? Thank you very much. Then we'll invite Suzanne and Stephen and then Tony. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Look, a word about the ICJ and the fact that there was no call for a ceasefire. Of course, I understand that, and I was disappointed, and many Palestinians were disappointed. But you know, that feeling was quickly followed by an appreciation on my part of how far we've actually come. You know, the idea a year ago even that anything like this would possibly happen, that Israel would be in the dock, required to, not only accused of crimes, but also with the idea that it's required to do things about those. That was never, is unprecedented, and it is very important. And we must not underestimate the effect of that on precisely the idea, the popular, the mass movements of solidarity with the Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle itself. It's very important. My second point, which is to do with the single democratic state. I mean, anybody who knows me knows how long I've supported this idea. Under a year ago, I published a book called One State, the Only Democratic Future for Palestine, Israel. There is no doubt in my mind that the people who have the most to gain from a single democratic state are the Palestinians, because it is the only way, in my view, that all of us would have our rights addressed, not least the right of return. This is the trajectory. I cannot disguise from anybody, and I'm sorry if I'm taking up too much time, I cannot disguise from anybody that the genocidal war now taking place in Gaza, the genocidal attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, will make the realization of this endpoint difficult for the time being. But there is no doubt in my mind, however difficult and however long it might take, that is the only endpoint for this situation.
Thank you, Ghada. Absolutely clear. Suzanne, would you like to make any final comments?
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank you again for inviting me to this fantastic panel. I've learned so much. I was very happy to hear Ronnie Kasrils talk about BDS, and what I did is I confirmed what he was saying, and that is that we must use that tool to help defeat Israel apartheid. I'd just like to say that I think that Omar Barghouti brings it into focus and explains, although he doesn't call it a revolutionary tool. I think it's revolutionary because it can it talks of, you can strike at the point of production, like a strike, and you bring in the peoples who are mobilized already in the world. You bring them into the struggle, and they have a part in seizing these modes of productions and enforcing the corporations to heal. So I just wanted to point that out, that and the intersectionality of BDS is particularly important because it brings in other sections of the struggle into motion. And I think personally that BDS may very well be a tool as socialists that we can use in if we ever get to the point of transforming the governments and societies that we have today. Thank you again.
Thank you for that call to action, Suzanne. Thank you very much for coming on this evening. And Stephen, would you like to make some closing comments, please?
Yes. I just want to say that we all know that the US and the allies of US, the global North, has enabled so far this genocide that is continuing. And that being bad enough, what is now happening in withdrawing support from the UNRWA and thereby withdrawing support from the suffering Palestinian people, it's almost as if the global North and the US and allies are actually participating in the genocide. Up to now, they were enablers. Now they are partners almost. And I hope that there will be very strong protest against what they are doing to the UNRWA, victimizing it.
Yes.
But they are really victimizing the Palestinian people through it as well, joining in.
Yes, they're kicking everyone that's down, aren't they? Thank you, Stephen. And finally, yes. Tony, you had the last minute.
Okay, well, yes, it's shameful what is happening to UNRWA. I would just caution when people say Zionism is on its last legs. I think there is a difference between seeing the beginning of the end of Zionism and saying that it's on its last legs. Zionism may go out in a very bloody fashion. There are also massive differences between Israel and South Africa, let's be honest. In South Africa, there was a very large and powerful black working class, which had a power that the Palestinians do not have. And that is why, in a sense, the solidarity movement in the West needs to be much stronger and wider than that which we had for apartheid South Africa. We do have to remember that. We also have to remember, as was mentioned, that the black states surrounding South Africa gave support to the anti-apartheid struggle. With the exception of the Houthis, the Arab states, to one degree or another, are complicit in what Israel is doing, Egypt in particular, but Saudi Arabia, the Gulf Sheikdoms, and so on and so forth. I mean, they are criminals themselves, and the overthrow of those regimes is absolutely essential to the overthrow of Zionism. And so, yes, the Houthis are absolute heroes for what they've done, and the hypocrisy of the West in saying attacking shipping is a breach of international law, but killing thousands of people is apparently okay. I mean, just points out the hypocrisy of the war criminals that we have in the West, whether it's Biden, Sunak, Starmer, or whoever. But I also want to mention, finally, one other factor which hasn't been mentioned, and that is the heroic Gazan resistance itself. Israel has not been able to defeat Hamas and the other groups that are fighting them, and they have taken quite clearly very large casualties, and that is a factor in itself. Now, I've been arrested for saying I support Hamas and the Palestinian resistance, but I will continue to say that because I do, and because they are fighting against those who are committing genocide. And so we have to bear in mind the differences as well as the similarities. But the clear message to us is we have to go out and do much more than we are doing. And this meeting is just really a small contribution to that, because we also have to tackle head on the narrative of the Holocaust and how the Zionists have weaponized it in order to justify everything they're doing. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming here. Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you, Ghada, Suzanne, Ilan, and Stephen. And
yes, thank you. We will put up the recordings from this meeting on our YouTube channel. We will write to all attendees with details from the chat, important contacts and links. And I would like to just say again, thanks to all the panelists and indeed to everybody who's come along this evening. And to remember Ilan's words, it's up to us. Thank you and good evening.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.